President Trump's reception at NATO. Dems are in disarray over Iran. A radical anti-Semitic socialist is one step away from becoming mayor of New York City. All of that and so much more today on 10 Minute Drill.
Everybody get up, get up.
The story of America is the story of an adventure.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
Yesterday, President Trump was at NATO, and he got a very surprising reception.
President Trump, dear Donald, you made this change possible. Your leadership on this has already produced $1 trillion in extra spending from European allies since 2016. And the decisions today will produce trillions more for our common defense to make us stronger and fairer by equalizing spending between America and America's allies.
That was NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who was praising what we are calling the Trump Doctrine, which has been for the last several years calling on America's NATO allies to invest more in their own defense. Here's President Trump talking about the commitments that came out of this summit.
In a very historic milestone this week, the NATO allies committed to dramatically increase their defense spending to that 5% of GDP.
This is particularly notable because we've heard from Democrats for several years that Europe and our friends and allies around the world don't really care for President Trump. But the reception he got, and particularly his reception he got after the pressure that he has put on Europe to invest more in their own defense with all of the conflicts around the world, got incredible praise.
I mean, would you ever think that this would be the result of this summit if he would not have been re-elected president? Do you really think that 7 or 8 countries who said, yeah, somewhere in the 2030s we might meet the 2%? We've now all decided in the last 4 or 5 months to get to 2%. So doesn't he deserve some praise?
President Trump was also praised for his decisiveness on Iran and the Israel situation and the decisiveness with which he took out Iran's nuclear facilities. In a lighthearted moment, there was a discussion again with NATO Secretary General Rutte, where he said this.
Then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
You have to use strong language. Every once in a while you have to use a certain word.
I think we're going to be hearing about that Daddy Trump line for a very long time. Speaking of the Trump Doctrine with regard to Europe, and particularly taking a stronger posture with Europe, a new report from a group called Public Policy Solutions, titled Europe's Attack on American Industry, Bad Allies Undermining U.S. Digital Services Leadership. The report highlights the ways Europe is targeting U.S. companies with absurd fees and taxes like the digital services tax, while letting China off the hook to gain ground within their countries. That report was sent to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who has spoken about this issue before.
Some of the European countries have put on an unfair digital service tax on our big internet provider.
Fox Business had great coverage of this report. Public Policy Solutions' Joe Grogan said this. While raising barriers against its closest economic partner, Europe has simultaneously deepened its exposure and relations to Chinese Communist Party-linked companies in critical infrastructure, including 5G and cloud services. The resulting vulnerabilities cut against the shared security interests of the United States and its allies. One thing Joe Biden constantly talked about with regard to foreign policy was his experience and his diplomatic success led to the fact that Europe would always take his calls. European leaders loved him and would praise him. But the main reason that they did that was because he allowed Europe to roll over America with so many of these absurd taxes and fees that allowed them to take advantage of our country. So, Public Policy Solutions is urging the Trump administration and Secretary Bessent to ensure that things like the digital services tax are included in these trade negotiations that are trying to level the playing field between the United States and Europe. One thing we've been tracking for several weeks now is how public opinion is reacting to President Trump's posture on Iran. One thing that we've consistently seen is Republicans are united behind President Trump's first position that Iran can't be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, but second, taking decisive action to take those out. Here's 2 of those polls.
That's why I think it's so important to note GOP on the U.S. airstrikes in Iran, 76% in the average of the 2 polls approve, compared to just 18% who disapprove.
So that, of course, was CNN, which we always love to harken back to. But here's CBS's poll. 85% of Republicans approve of the airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. 94% of MAGA Republicans support the U.S. airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. So again, there's been a lot of conversation about a Republican civil war, about Republican debate, but I think that that's largely been media giving outsized attention to what from this poll appears to be a tiny segment, about 5% of Republicans who oppose President Trump's decisive action to take out Iran's nuclear capabilities. However, on the other side, there is not the same level of unanimity. We have a case of Dems in disarray. First, an op-ed from an unexpected source. Anthony Blinken, who was Joe Biden's Secretary of State, had an op-ed in the New York Times both criticizing President Trump for taking out Iran's nuclear facilities, but also taking credit. So Blinken criticizes President Trump for his failure of diplomacy while failing to acknowledge what Joe Biden left behind. First, with his appeasement strategy of not answering back when Iran, for several years through their proxies, attacked U.S. military personnel around the world, something that we talked about in great detail in our last episode, but also Iran's role in funding Hamas in the October 7th attacks. President Biden's decision to delist Iranian proxies from terror watch lists, things like that. So as you consider the last several years and how we got to this point, but also the fact that Americans overwhelmingly support the actions that President Trump took to take out Iran's nuclear facilities, I think we can all agree nobody really cares about hearing from Anthony Blinken or anyone else from the Biden or Obama administrations that left this terrible situation in place. But as we look at Democrats on Capitol Hill, we talked last episode about how Democrat members like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were calling for an impeachment. That escalated with an impeachment motion filed by Representative Al Green, who you may remember from waving his cane and trying to shout down President Trump's joint address. He filed a motion to force a vote in the House of Representatives on an impeachment measure, and Democrats were not happy about it. Only 79 Democrats joined Al Green. Democrats seethed to Axios. One called it a completely unserious and selfish move. Most people think it's unhelpful. What a message to China and Russia. After we take military action, we try to impeach the president. This disarray is going to continue to cause problems for Democrats around the country who have to acknowledge the fact that taking out Iran's nuclear facilities was a popular move, but also are feeling so much pressure from the most radical parts of the Democrat base to continue doing everything they can to impeach President Trump. That energy carried into a New York Democrat primary for mayor. Last night, New York City Democrats advanced a self-proclaimed socialist in their primary for mayor, in addition to being overtly and proudly anti-Semitic, calling numerous times to globalize the Intifada, which again is calling for violence against Israel and against Jewish people. He's taken a number of other radical positions. This from Bill Malugin from Fox News. He's previously called for abolishing the NYPD, abolishing prisons, abolishing medical bills, abolishing private health insurance, banning all guns, legalizing sex work, calling for safe injection sites, ending cash bail, decriminalizing drug possessions, ending sentencing enhancement, ending all cooperation with ICE. Now, to be fair to the people of New York, he was up against Andrew Cuomo, who is famous right now for two major things. One, a series of complaints about sexual harassment, and two, his role during the coronavirus pandemic, where he was responsible for the deaths of thousands of senior citizens. So in a choice between a serial sexual harasser who killed grandparents and a radical socialist, the people of New York picked a radical socialist. But let's get to know him a little bit better from some of his past tweets. Queer liberation means defund the police. Defunding the police is a feminist issue. Our prison system relies on dehumanization and brutality, so the goal must be to abolish this exploitative system entirely. One thing that's interesting about his election results is how he represents what we've described as the new Democrat coalition. Look at the demographic breakdowns, particularly among income levels. As you see here in a helpful graphic from the New York Times, poor working class voters did not vote for Mamdani. They voted for Andrew Cuomo. But when you look at middle income, he won by 10%, and higher income, 13%. So again, as Joe Biden spent the last 4 years overwhelmingly targeting his agenda to higher income white liberals, Mamdani's following a very similar model of catering to, again, college-educated white liberals. So this is a tough fight for Democrats in a number of New York area swing districts, but also the New York governor's race for Kathy Hochul, who has largely been seen as a failure, who has a very difficult governor's race coming up, but also in neighboring New Jersey, where a number of New Jerseyans work in New York and have to deal with New York's policies. So this will likely be an issue in the New Jersey governor's race, where Democrat Mikey Sherrill will have to answer whether or not she stands with this anti-Semitic radical socialist who wants to end the entire law enforcement program in the United States. So we will watch all of this closely and see the impact of this massive result in New York City. Last week, we talked about a bombshell report from a group called State Armor about how the Chinese Communist Party is working with American climate radicals to try and hurt America's energy industry. Yesterday, in the Senate Judiciary Committee, they held a hearing focused on how China is also trying to harm the U.S. energy industry through litigation, supporting a number of radical lawsuits against energy companies in an effort to bankrupt the energy resources America relies on, which, as we know, downstream will help China in a big way as they continue to grow that industry and try and own more and more of that market worldwide. Here are some highlights from that hearing.
We're witnessing right now a systematic campaign against American energy. There is a coordinated assault by the radical left, backed and paid for by the Chinese Communist Party.
Energy Foundation China channels tens of millions of dollars to numerous environmental groups, yes.
Now, Mr. Walter, my Democrat colleagues have said that's a crazy conspiracy theory. What is the basis for saying that Energy Foundation China is funneling so many millions of dollars into these suits?
Well, their own IRS filings, because they're a 501c3 registered in San Francisco.
Now, as we would have expected, there was some pushback from Democrat Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
Renewable energy is now the cheapest form of energy on the planet.
Sheldon was swiftly reminded of the numerous times he has voted to divert tax dollars to his own wife's dark money group that also is working alongside the Chinese Communist Party to hurt U.S. energy interests. For today's You Can't Make It Up segment, we want to take a small 2x4 to some CBO analysis about how President Trump's big beautiful bill is going to impact people. This analysis finds the biggest driver of loss for lower income families is cuts to Medicaid and SNAP. But as we've talked about in almost every episode here, I know I sound like a broken record, those cuts to Medicaid and SNAP overwhelmingly impact illegal immigrants. Both Medicaid and SNAP are giving resources to illegal immigrants, but also men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s playing video games in their underwear at home, choosing not to work. We know from CBO's own analysis that there is a large number of people using those programs and taking the benefit. And that is what these cuts are for. But CBO does not include that in their analysis. So as CBO talks about cutting $1,600 per year from the lowest income Americans, you have to again remember that the people that are being targeted with that are either ineligible people from the programs who your senior citizen grandma is having to compete with to get basic care, or illegal immigrants. The other part of this analysis that really bothered me was this particular line from CBS's coverage of the report. The analysis also argues that the One Big Beautiful Bill boosts the government resources going to the highest earning 10% of U.S. households by $12,000 per year. But as you read that analysis a little bit further, those government resources going to the wealthy that they're referring to aren't some kind of gift or handout. They're referring to how much those people are taxed. So they're referring to our private income that hasn't even been taxed yet as a government resource that should be considered here. So again, just consider how absurd that is. The money we haven't even been made yet, CBO is using to score as a resource to give out or take back. I think that's outrageous and un-American. So again, as you learn more about the Big Beautiful Bill, you will overwhelmingly hear negative coverage because reports like this, reports that suggest it is a major cut to lower income people when you remove illegal immigrants and ineligible people from SNAP and Medicaid. They consider it gifting resources to higher income people when they're allowed to keep more of the money they made to spend in the economy, which is incredibly good for the economy. And you'll see these same reports from CBO talk about how the distribution of these resources is not even, but that's because the collection of taxes is not even. People that make more money pay overall a lot more taxes. And so letting more people keep more of their own money across the board is an incredibly good thing. The bottom line here, the Big Beautiful Bill is full of incredibly positive things that you're never hearing about in media. A middle-class tax cut that people desperately need right now. Funds to close the border and continue to carry out the deportation of dangerous criminal illegal immigrants that 70 to 80% of the country overwhelmingly supports. Fixes to Medicaid that will allow people that you care about to access Medicaid more easily because they're taking people like illegal immigrants and men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s who are choosing not to work and playing video games off the program so that your people that you care about that deserve to be on the program, the widows, the orphans, the disabled, the people that actually need it, can get that care without having to compete. So again, as you see this coverage and you hear Democrats talk about the One Big Beautiful Bill, remember that context. The media and the Congressional Budget Office and everybody else is actively working against things that make this a very, very good bill. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on 10 Minute Drill. Please like, subscribe, tell your friends, leave us a review. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.